Hi, and thank you so much for choosing to learn chess with me. A little bit about me. My name is Laura Smith. I'm a national master and I've been playing chess since I was 6 years old. I am really excited to teach you the foundations of endgame study in this course. As a young player, I was extremely lucky to study with the late and incredible grandmaster and chess coach, Pal Benko. I remember very clearly, like it was yesterday, even though it was many years ago, sitting in the historic Marshall Chess Club and learning from Grandmaster Pal Benko the gems of the endgame. And in this course, I hope to excite you about all the hidden gems of this part of the game, and also to give you a starting point so that you can dive deeper in as you progress. The topics that I will be going through in this course are the opposition, the rule of the square, triangulation and zugzwang, and beautiful breakthroughs. So, use this course to learn the basics, but I also include bonus challenges and exercises throughout the chapters. And again, thank you so much for choosing Endgame Magic. Part 1, the fundamentals of opposition. As I designed this Endgame Magic course, my brain wanted to go in many different directions. I've decided for my students, one of the most beneficial parts of the endgame can be designated into a few big topics that I will give you some amazing techniques to win those one games, right? And to draw the games when you have the disadvantage, when you're down the pawn, or when things aren't looking your way. Just a small story from my past. I've been playing chess since I was 6 years old, lucky to have had so much support from family and my chess coaches. One chess coach that I have the honor to say that I studied with was Grandmaster Pal Benko. He would teach me at the Marshall Chess Club endgames, his expertise an expert of all parts of the game. And I remember learning about the opposition. I didn't know it would be so interesting. I was more of a tactical player, loved my openings. But as I said in the introduction, the endgame is so important. And it's my goal for my students to show you the magic of the endgame. So let's just dive right in. The first part, the opposition. So what is that? Opposition is a position in which the kings are on the same file, rank, or diagonal, one square away, to keep it simple, okay? So here, let me demonstrate to you what opposition is, and then we'll start to see why it is such an important technique to always be aware of. So here, before we even look at the moves, I want you to orient yourself to the board. So we've got a white king on d4, black king on c7, and a white pawn on c4, okay? Let's gain the direct opposition here. So where should my king go? I could go to d5, e5, or c5. Now, because I've been studying chess for so many years, it comes naturally, but that did not come overnight. It took many years of practice. The direct opposition would be king to c5. Notice how my king is on the same file as my opponent's king with only one square in between. I have now gained the opposition, and why is that important, Laura, you might ask? Let me show you. Now, my opponent has to move, right? There's no passing in chess. So the question becomes, where can the king move? Let's play around. King b7. Well, guess what? After gaining the opposition, I can now go king to d6. So what's the big deal, you might ask? Well, let me show you. As the king tries to stay in front of my pawn that wants to promote, I can again gain the opposition and force the king out. We call this gaining key squares. Watch this. I can now bring my king to b7, and I have now gained control of the key promoting squares. This is where the magic of the endgame becomes so fun, because We want to promote our pawn. And here, let's see how this pawn does not have to worry one bit. The king leaves, and we promote into a queen, right? That came across only because of direct opposition. How about now we take a look at another opportunity? What happens if instead of king b7, our opponent played king c8? I want us to get, in this course, I want you to always have opportunities to try it on your own. So we're gonna take a pause here. I want you to study this position, white to move, and find the opposition. So what did you find? If you said king c6, you are on fire. That's absolutely correct. You are gaining the opposition. Amazing. And why is it the opposition? The kings are on the same file. Note the C file. And they're one square away. Squeeze that king out. And then here, take a moment again. I want you to try it out. So where would you play? White to move. You're so close to victory. How are you going to convert your advantage into that, what we call at chess clubs, that shiny W, a win, right? Now you might say, Laura, should I get that opposition again? Well, here I want you to start, I'm going to challenge you in this course. I want you to calculate what's the best way to ensure that our passed pawn can be protected when it queens. If you said king b7, that's correct. Your king is helping the pawn with these key squares. And let's just play it out for some practice, right? King goes to d8, stays close, and we get a very similar position that we saw in our first example. As I encourage my students, when you're doing my chess course or any chess study, it is so important to really visualize yourself across the board in real time so that when you encounter these positions and that timer is moving your clock, if you're playing online or if you are in the club playing a chess tournament or in a big event, you don't have to feel the nerves as much. So let's practice that now. I want you to try this out. This is a white to move example. You are down a pawn and you only have 60 seconds on your clock and your opponent only has 1 minute and 22 seconds. So it's at the end of that game. White to move and find the opposition. Try it out. King e2, if you got king e2, great work. So you have gained the opposition. But as I tell my students, life is not so easy. They will not necessarily concede the draw. If they play king d4, you need to keep finding those techniques that we're learning in this course. So again, fight for the opposition. Go king d2 here. And now we get to a crucial position. Black has just played pawn to e4. Did you know that only one single move here for white can draw the game? Everything else, unfortunately, after all that hard work, would end in a loss. Let's take a look. Let's start to calculate. If I play king to d1, see, I know I have it on the cursor here, right? But if you can start to visualize it, it's going to be really helpful for all parts of your game. If I play king d1, my opponent now could gain the opposition with king d3, right? And sure, I can hide on e1. You know, I'm doing what my coach told me. My king's in front of the pawn. However, my opponent can play king d6 and gain that opposition and squeeze the king out. And now the tides have turned and now black will have the win because the king is controlling the key squares to promotion that we've been discussing. So let's learn from that. And when we get to a position such as pawn to e4, I want you to keep your king in front of the pawn without allowing your opponent's king to take the opposition. If they play pawn to e3, I know your clock is ticking, but still, if you can, if there's an increment, or if you can use that time valuably, think about where should my king go right now so that my opponent's king cannot take the opposition. If you go king d1, same trap. They're going to play king to d3. So I want to pause here and I want you to try it out. Where would you play to prevent your opponent from taking away that important opposition. King E1, keep the king in front on the same file. As we go through the course and the practice, I promise you it will become much more natural. And finally, here, please gain that opposition like we've learned. And if they play pawn to E2, I've got to show you this great technique. You bring your king in front, and they're forced to actually put you in stalemate to hold their pawn. If they play any other move, you grab the pawn and it is a draw. If they keep holding on to that E2 pawn, it is now stalemate. So this is a very important topic that you will encounter in your game, so I encourage you to practice over the board these positions. Okay, here we go. Another example of opposition. White to move, right? Let's get a little oriented with our board geography, right? Always be paying close attention to the board vision. Where is my king? Where's my opponent's king? What pawns are on the board, right? Where it looks pretty even, but that's what the magic of the endgame is. There are a finite number of pieces on the board, so you have the power to calculate, especially if time is on your side. And if time isn't on your side, that's why you study, so that when it is your chance to shine, you have those techniques at your fingertips. So white to move, I want you to think, how can I gain the opposition? Keeping my king on the same, in this case, file with one square away. Likely, king h4. Very, very good. I want to show you why it's important, because if we know the why, it's going to help our whole study make so much more sense. So you might say, okay, my king can just travel and win this pawn before my opponent's king. But this is kind of interesting. This is what the magic of the endgame is. I want to show you two things. Watch. So true, you could say, Laura, doesn't matter. I'm going to win that B pawn. Look. Okay, great. You won it. And now I have a tempo. A tempo is when you have time on your side in chess. So I want to force it to be my opponent's turn. Unfortunately, if I go here, it's a draw because of what I taught you in the last part, that the king doesn't need to give you the opposition. They just stay and hang tight here. However, in this particular position, I can gain tempo with this little move and still get the opposition. However, if we backtrack for a moment, you might say, see, Laura, king h4 and king g4, whatever. Now watch this small difference that you might say, I don't see why it matters, but when you start to study the endgame and you take that time, you'll see the small difference. So if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, if I don't gain the opposition here, did you know that my opponent can force a draw with that one slight difference? I'm going to show you. Remember how I told you that this pawn had tempo? Well, guess what? Chess is a two-player game, and you need to keep your opponent's strategies in mind all the time. So watch, they could play b3, this beautiful sacrifice, because they're gonna lose the pawn anyway. I must capture it, and suddenly my opponent just gained the opposition. And I can try to get there, and I can, but watch this difference. I have no tempos here, and it's a draw by force. Of course, accurate play is necessary. I must maintain the opposition if I'm playing black, and I must not give it away. And that's why you should take your time at this point of the course to ask yourself, if I was playing black here, would you play king c7 here? Would you play king b6? I want you to think about that. Try it out. Where would you play? If you said king b6, you're using the understanding that we're learning today about opposition to your advantage. If we play a move like king c7, unfortunately, white gains the opposition, and now white can win again. From this example, I found it to be a beautiful study. I want you to start calculating every single move, because as I told you in the endgame, one of the things on your side is that there's less pieces on the board. So you can use this as an opportunity, as mentioned in the introduction, to increase your calculation across all parts of your game. All right, ready for another one? Let's take a look. Here, it's black to move, and it looks a little grim. There's this pawn on the 6th rank, see the number 6 here? And it's close to promoting. However, if you know the power of the opposition, you can claim your draw as if you find the correct move, so try it out. If you had answered king to e8, unfortunately diagonal opposition, which we can look at, in this case would not help you because you have to think, what would my opponent play here? They would squeeze the king out and get control of that promoting square, getting that amazing queen. So here, if you had said king to g8, you have gained the opposition. The kings are both on the g file and I have to move. If I move my king, you attack my pawn, right? And if I keep going, you're just in time and you can actually gain the draw through that same stalemate pattern. I want you to pay attention to that. See here, the king, pawn, king. If any of this is a little bit new, you can always watch the chapter over and over again because these concepts don't come right away. You do need to practice them. So just keep up the great work and soon these will become easier for you. For our last chapter on opposition, I offer you a challenge. It's a bonus, so don't feel bad if it's a little bit more challenging, but I feel that it is useful to see these concepts when there are not just pawns on the board. Many people say that opposition does mainly happen when there's just kings and pawns, which is true, but I want to show you that endgame strategies can translate to all parts of your game and calculating. So here we can see white has a rook advantage for the knight. When we're up the rook for the knight, we call that being up the exchange. Black also has 2 pawns and we have 1. So we're up a little bit, but it's a little unclear as black has this pretty powerful threat, forcing move, to put our king in check and attack our king and the rook. So we do need to be careful. If we do an kind of obvious move, pawn takes pawn, they can go knight takes pawn, and it's really not so clear. The king can try to gain some space here, but you know, they can just check us around. And if you're not careful, I just have to show you, you could find yourself in a lost position very quickly as well. So let's take a look at this very interesting study. What if I told you that the best move here was to sacrifice your exchange back? Rook takes knight, king takes, and then to go pawn takes pawn. You might say, Laura, isn't it a draw? It's so even, king for king, pawn for pawn. But let's use all that we've been learning about the opposition to calculate and see if we can convert into a win. If black plays king g7, really huddling close to the g6 pawn, I want to invite you to try it out on your own. Can you find the opposition for white here? Now, there were 2 interesting ideas. In my classes, we often do a poll. And an interesting move, you might say, oh, king e5 is on the same diagonal as the king. Problem is that we can't really gain too much territory. We're kind of stuck. If you said king e7, congrats, that's the right one. That is a great example of opposition, not on a file, but on a rank. Let's go through it to use all the skills and techniques we've been learning to convert this advantage to a shiny W win. King h7, when you get to this point, it's hard not to smile because you're so close to winning. King f6, they have to leave. There's different options. Let's try king h8, right? We win the pawn. They gain the opposition. However, we have a tempo. So here, I want you to stop, think, and try to calculate. Can you see the win? I might even encourage you to get out your chessboard. It's white to move and see, can you squeeze the king out so that we can gain control of the queening squares? So I'm going to give you about a minute here. Think and take your time if you need to. Okay. King h6. Now they have 2 options, right? If they leave, Let's use our key squares. We've squeezed the king out where they want to be. They want to stay in front of your pawn. But now your king has given what I also like to think of like a red carpet. You're at the awards. This pawn is taken care of because the king cannot stop it now. And it can promote into a queen, right? So the other option for if you're playing black after king h6, right, could be, oh, I got the opposition. But thankfully we have this tempo and we can play g6. And after g7, the king is squeezed out again, promoting to a queen. This is just the foundations of opposition. I hope that you can use the techniques that we've learned in your own games, and as you study, you can see how opposition is super important to your game. In this part, we are going to learn about the square of the pawn. I will teach you some important calculating strategies so that you don't have to waste your calculating energy on certain inevitable truths of the endgame. So what does the square of the pawn even mean? What is the rule of the square? Both are used interchangeably. So the square of the pawn, it's foundational for endgame study, and it's going to help you with your calculating and understanding. Let's take a look. So you notice, as I always tell my students, let's orient ourselves to the board. We've got our kings and we are up one pawn. Now, basically, the rule of the square means, is the pawn able to do this treacherous journey to the 8th rank, promoting into a magical queen without the help of its king? If it doesn't need any help, then the opposing king needs to be in the square. Let's take a look. So if I know it's my turn and I can play a4, watch what happens. The square. Look, we are on square a4 right now, right? And look at the beauty of chess when we look at them, like the math relationships and see these amazing ideas. So this pawn needs to, there's 5 squares to the promotion square, and we stretched it out so you have this really nice square. I want to ask you something. Can the black king go into this square on their turn? If the answer is no, then this pawn is unstoppable. It doesn't need anyone's help. It's going to turn into a queen. However, if this king could enter that square, that means that the king is in the square of the pawn and it can catch the pawn. Why is this so important, you ask? Well, you might be thinking, is my pawn stoppable or not? Now, true, you could calculate out loud or in your, by moving pawn to, moving in your head, a4, king f8, a5, king e8, a6, king d8, a7, king c8, a8, queen. Even, it might sound like, wow, Laura, you've been playing so long and you're a chess master. I can't do that. You absolutely can. You can take your time and do that. But the reason why I want my students to know this important concept is because there's so much magic here. You can feel confident that you will promote your pawn when the king is not in the square, and same if you're on the side that it has the disadvantage, you can draw certain positions knowing that your king will get there in time. Now, let's look at it on the board. a4, the king is not able to be in the square, so we can prove it, no problem, that our pawn can queen first, right? Now let's look at a different part. Let's go to what happens if the king is in the square of the pawn. Now, if you don't believe me, happy to show you. So if I play b4 here, right, I can make my little square, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's a beautiful square. The king's in the square of the pawn. Shouldn't I be good? The problem is that this white king is super active here. So with every rule, there's sometimes going to be, oddballs. Here, it actually is a win for white because I can use a concept from our earlier section. After b4, okay, I can, squeeze the king out. I can get my king in front of my pawn, which is what I want in the endgame. And there is no way for my opponent to stop me from queening my pawn. So I do win the game, right? Now, let's take a look. Let's look at square of the pawn, okay? White to move, right? I want to ask you to try it out. You can pause and take as much time as you want. I encourage you to start calculating like I did. Say the moves out loud, and you'll see that this is great for all parts of the game. So it says, okay, white to move. Is this black king able to get to the square of the pawn? Very interesting, because if it was black to move, we'll see what happens. But take a moment, white to move. Do you think the result is a win for white or a draw? And why? If you said draw, nope, white can win, because unfortunately that king cannot get into the square, right? Do you see here my arrow? I want to show you something. In addition to the square, you also can use this arrow technique because you've drawn that, it's almost like a right triangle, okay? And there's no way for that black king to hop in there in time. So I wanted to show that to you as well, because I go a4 and they can go to f8, but it's just not quick enough, right? Let's see. There's no way to get there in time. Thus, that black king was not in the square of the pawn. Let's take a look, and I really want to show you why it's so important to understand these foundational ideas, because you will encounter them in your own game. So here it's black to move. I want you to try it out. Do you think black can get into the square of this a pawn if it's black to move? So calculate, and when you're ready, you can press play. If you said that black is losing, no, black is actually able to draw here. If you said a draw, really good. The way we look at it is, will the king be able to get into the square of the pawn in time, right? So let's see if we can calculate a little bit at this point. So if we were to go king f7, white could try a4, right? And there's that same square, right? But here, the big difference is black is just in time. I really want to stress the importance of this concept, because if you can start getting comfortable with it, it can translate to many different phases of the game. The opening, the middle game, where you value the time and the tempo of moves, and you start to take that into strong consideration on where you place your pieces and all the positional play. So let's see how this goes. Let's take a moment to really appreciate king f7. It still might seem like quite a ways away, but you don't have to even, if you can understand that the king can enter this square, remember that arrow I showed you, or the square, if you're more comfortable in that way, then you're in good shape. You can go to e7 or e8, and the reason why I'm not moving the white king is it's just too slow. And then you get that draw, right? After learning these foundations of rule of the square or square of the pawn, I hope that it will encourage you in your endgame journey and your chess journey to get to the level that you want, because now you can understand that this is an important topic, and to use it when you do get into endgames, to start thinking, is my king able to catch that pawn? And if you're on the winning side, you can also be reassured before you get to this position by knowing, well, the other king cannot get into the square of my pawn, so my pawn cannot be stopped. Ever heard the saying, do as I say, not as I do? So I really tell my students here, chess, to be pretty simplistic here, is a complicated game. But when I first learned this topic, I was intimidated, and I beg you, don't be intimidated by this chapter title like I was. Triangulation, what is that? And am I able to understand it? In this course, as I've said before, I am introducing you to important endgame foundations, and from there, you take your time and you'll learn the intricacies of each of them. Let's break it down before we dive into this triangulation of the king, right? I just want to say, have you ever wished when you were playing a game with your friend or your kid or your colleague that you wish that they would have to pass their move and you could just go along your business? You want them to move. Well, this happens in chess because we don't pass. Sometimes we wish that our opponent would just be able to let us move. Today we're going to learn about Zugzwang, and that is going to help us understand the triangulation that we see in a lot of basic endgames. So what is Zugzwang? It's a German word. It means that the plight of having to move. Sometimes we just like our position and we don't want to move. We want them to move out the way. So sometimes it's disadvantageous to have to move. Well, what if I told you that there's some endgame magic? We're going to sprinkle some fairy dust into this one because I'm going to prove to you that I can force your opponent to have to move. Let's take a look. What is triangulation? Well, in its essence, yes, there's something to do with a triangle. You are going to it's a lot to do with a triangle. Like, you're going to make a triangle with your king and reach the exact same position. I have a question for you. Let's take a look at this position. We got kings on the board. It looks very clear that we are up a pawn, right? 2 for 1, right? However, with all the topics we've seen, there are chances for black to make a stalemate here or to gain the opposition. Now, what happens if I play this move? It looks pretty good, right? Well, king e8. And what am I going to do? I could go f7. Looks good. They're going to play king f8 here. And again, remember we've been seeing this technique. Now, if you are playing black, congratulations, because you just got a draw. It's a stalemate. The king it's black's turn, but there's nowhere to go. So, okay, so that move doesn't work too well, right? Have you ever heard the saying, do as I say, not as I do? I always ask my students this because I have to be honest with you, chess is a really complicated game, and at times, even for experienced players, it can feel intimidating. This topic that I'm about to immerse you in can sound a little bit hard. I really ask that you believe in yourself, have the confidence, and know that you don't need to learn this all in one day. We're going to look at it, and then practice will make perfect. The title of this section, Triangulation. It's a complicated subject, but we can see the beauty of it, the magic of it, and it's very worth our time. So let's dive in. Have you ever wished you could pass your move in chess? Well, that's in essence what triangulation is. It is a form of something called Zugzwang, a German word meaning the plight of having to move. Wouldn't it be great if we could sometimes not move, right? It sometimes is actually disadvantageous to move. So we can actually use this concept to our advantage. Let me show you a little bit of what I mean. You can see this position. I've shown you the path my king would love to take. I'd love to go to f5, go to g6, and then win this pawn, right? This h-pawn. However, if I go king f5, I have to keep in mind what my opponent could play. So they see I'm going to go king g6. They have a plan. They're going to stop me. Take a moment and imagine you were playing the black side here. What would you play to stop my plan? King f7, right? Taking control of that square, and also a nice opposition example. And, if I move king e5, that's fine. But, they can just play king f8. And if I was to try king e6, do you see what they could do here? I'd really encourage you to pause here and use what we've learned in opposition to get the draw as black. So black to move, can you see a very strong move? King e8, getting the opposition, right? And sure, I can march my pawn one last time, but after king f8, I really don't have many great options. If I leave, I lose my pawn, leading to a draw, as long as the black king, right, stays behind the h pawn. And if I hold on to dear life for that pawn, I end in the same pattern that we've gone over in the course of stalemate, right? All right, so I can't do what I want. So what should I do? Wouldn't it be amazing if it was their turn? Couldn't I just force, but I'm clicking, it's not their turn. But triangulation allows us to make it their turn. Watch and see. If we play king e4, right? And let me just note, if they ever go king f7, that's our chance to be natural, go king f5, and then gain what we want, right? They might see that because we have to give our opponent the respect of their plan and their strategy, right? So if they don't go king f7 and let us go king f5, what could they do? They could go king e8. Now, if I go king e5, they're just going to wait along for me. I need to triangulate one more time. I'm going to go king f4. And now, could you believe it? It's the same position, but this time it's not my turn. It's my opponent's turn. This is the endgame magic I talk about. The control over the position. And if they ever go king f7, I know we're going to go king f5. So they can't do that. What happens if they try this like they did in that other position? Well, remember what we learned before? If we can gain the opposition, that's putting us in a great position. But be careful. Never count those chickens until they hatch. King f8, right? And I'll show you what I mean by that. Get ready to be challenged. So I'm happy. I have forced my opponent to give up the opposition. That's big. I can go f7. They have to go king g7. I want to queen this pawn, right? So let me use my king to help my pawn out. But don't get greedy and don't get overconfident. In this position, did you know you're still not necessarily at the finish line? I've seen this happen to so many of my students and even some of my contemporaries. Like, you just get so close to the win and you're all confident and you don't take a moment to calculate. If you promote here to a queen, I'm gonna actually pause for us here, right? Does anyone see what would happen if we promoted that pawn to a queen here? I'm gonna give you a moment to think about that. Yeah, it would be stalemate, and it's happened before. I also like to show my students that there's never a reason to resign when you have countered play. Of course, I should say, when you're playing a stronger player, you got to be respectful. If you're down a lot of material, there are times when it's considered good sportsmanship to resign. However, when you're playing, the beginning and intermediate levels, club play, there's no reason why you can't play it out and hope for a great opportunity like this. If I was playing black here, I just earned a draw because my king is not in check. I have no legal moves, and my pawn doesn't either. So I just earned a stalemate. However, let's stop here again. I want you to try it out. It is a win for white. You have two options. Some of my youngest students actually amazed me a couple weeks ago, showing me a better move than I thought. So white to move, if you can find one win, awesome. And if you see two, really nice to sometimes weigh out your options. If you said pawn to f8 equals a rook, nice. You're now up the rook, and it's almost time to start calculating checkmate, right? Just to play it out a little bit, we could just bring our rook back, right? No need to always be so fancy, right? You can even win this pawn. Like, you don't have to, and then you could win by checkmate, that beautiful back rank checkmate, right? However, I want to stress the fact that in chess there are sometimes more than one right answer. So if you rather be even more powerful and you really want that queen, sure, just don't do it right away. But you could move your king to e8, and if king g7, now's a great opportunity to promote your pawn to a queen, and just don't let them stalemate, right? Take a minute, think, and then you could do this fun checkmate. I hope that triangulation is something that you welcome and don't feel like you need to master this extremely challenging topic in a day, but start using the idea of zugzwang, making it your opponent's turn, and also using the king movement of triangulation so that you can convert those positions that are winning into 1 games.